Hello, my name is Lisa Rose and I've been asked to do a little video to discuss feeding your baby. So what I'm going to start off with is feeding cues, what to look out for and when to know that your baby is hungry. So whenever I do my parent craft sessions, I normally put out to all my parents, I'm like, what signs do you think are a good sign to show that your baby is hungry? And 100% always someone comes back with crying. Crying tells me that my baby is hungry. Now that's not necessarily incorrect because obviously babies cry a lot and quite often they will cry when they are hungry. But generally if a baby has gotten to the point that they are crying, then they have gone past sort of the early signs of trying to show that they are hungry and wanting food, and they're now at the point where they are really quite hangry. You know, they need to be fed quite instantly, and it is difficult sometimes to feed a baby who is crying a lot because especially if you're breastfeeding, you want a nice calm happy baby who can explore the breast a little bit and open their mouth nice and wide and go onto the breast quite calmly. Whereas if you have like a screaming angry baby, they kind of just start chomping on anything and they're likely to clamp quite shortly and have a shallow latch. So if you find that you get to the point that you have a crying baby, then it's really important that you just try and calm that baby down, do a little bit of skin to skin and singing and talking and, you know, keeping your baby close and rocking and gently sort of rocking and walking around with your baby will help calm them down, ready to get into a position to feed your baby. So what sort of cues are early cues? So early cues of a hungry baby are like just gentle sort of stirring. So if you've put them down and they're in their Moses basket or cot, wherever you have them, so that gentle sort of starting to look around, like just move their body a little bit, gentle head movements, and maybe a little bit of opening and closing of their mouth. So sometimes they're lying there but they start opening, closing their mouth, and they're the really early signs to show you, okay, my baby's starting to get quite hungry now. And it's good at that point, if you're breastfeeding or artificially feeding, for you to start getting your environment ready. So obviously if you're artificially feeding, you can start prepping your bottle. If you're breastfeeding, you can start getting yourself nice and cozy and getting your snacks ready to be able to sit down comfortably for quite a while to feed your baby. More obvious cues are just slightly more movement around wherever they are, putting their hands towards their mouth, and sometimes they'll start sucking on their hands a little bit because they're trying to find food. So this is a baby's instinctive way of trying to look for something that must be food, and they don't quite know what their hands are yet, so they're just putting anything near their face, anything that's near their face they might try and suck on. So when that's happening, you have to start thinking, okay, my baby's quite hungry now, I definitely need to be getting myself ready or getting something ready to feed my baby. And then the late cues are that frantic movement, that I am hungry right now, give me my food, and that crying and angry baby. Do you know, they can get quite red in the face and they want food now, because babies don't quite understand the concept of waiting. So when they get to that point, they want their food there and then. So then that's when you need to try and walk around and calm your baby down a bit, so that whichever way they're feeding, they're going to get a good latch, or they're not going to swallow too much wind from trying to get food too quickly, and that sort of thing. So they're the main cues to be looking out for. Try and catch your baby on those early cues. There is the odd time where babies go from 0 to 100 really fast. I've known it with my own son, and I've known it with you know, mums and babies who I've gone and seen at home, where they're completely flat out asleep, absolutely can't, and then they wake up screaming. And there's not a lot you can do in those moments. You just have to try and calm your baby down and follow the same principles of keeping your baby close, keeping your baby warm, walking around and rocking your baby gently until they stop crying, bring them down a bit, and then try and position them and feed them correctly again. Another question I get a lot is, how do I know that my baby's had enough? Especially from mums who are breastfeeding and their partners and stuff, because you can't actually see how much you're putting into your baby. They constantly think, well, I don't know if my baby's having enough, I don't know if my baby's having enough. And it's really important to be aware that in the first few days after birth, the first 3 days, babies don't actually have a lot. They only get colostrum from the breast, so they only take very small amounts. So it's it's sort of reiterating that they don't need a lot, they just want to feed frequently and often because they have such small stomachs. So I've got some sort of little props here to show you the size of babies' stomachs when they're first born. So a newborn baby's stomach is sort of just slightly bigger than a marble, but not very big at all. In relation to a pen, a normal pen, you can see that actually newborn baby stomachs aren't really that big. So for the first sort of 1 or 2 days, that's sort of the size of a newborn stomach, so they can't take a lot. So even if they are artificially fed, they will probably only have like 20-30 mils at a time, because their stomachs are so small, until their stomachs stretch slightly bigger. Generally by about day 3 to 5, their stomachs have grown to around about the size of a ping pong ball. So still not that big, but they can take a little bit more. And if you're breastfeeding, it's generally around day 3 where your milk supply your milk will turn from colostrum to full milk, and you'll have a lot more there. You'll feel your breast, the milk coming through. So then babies will take a little bit more, maybe settle a bit longer between feeds, but not necessarily. And then if you're artificially feeding, they may take up to a couple of ounces. Artificial milk stretches a baby's stomach, so some babies quite quickly take bigger amounts, and that's just because it's heavier, so it will stretch a baby's stomach a bit quicker, whereas breast milk is quite light, full of lots and lots of fat, but quite light, so it generally doesn't stretch their stomach quite so well. It's one of the reasons why breast milk versus artificial milk is linked to potential long-term obesity because of that stretching of the stomach in some studies. So that's the size of a baby's stomach on day 3 to 5, and then by about day 10 it's only about the size of an egg, really. So they never actually have very big stomachs, which is why babies feed little and often, and they're very frequent feeders. And I know a lot of people try and get their babies into a routine really quick of having a bigger bottle, or try and give their baby a bigger bottle before bed because then they'll be full for longer, but it goes against the nature of a baby's stomach. They're only meant to take in small amounts, little and often, and hence why they feed frequently, and babies don't sleep for very long, and we advise babies to feed in the first few days of every sort of 3 to 4 hours, and breastfed babies will generally feed 1 to 2 hourly because they're smaller amounts, but they want it more frequently because it goes through their system a bit better. And if they feed little and often, they're less likely to have issues such as constipation and difficulties opening their bowels, because they're only having small amounts, so it just keeps going through them. Whereas if you give them big amounts, it's a lot for their body to process, which can then lead on to issues like constipation. So another sign to know that your baby is feeding enough, whichever way you're feeding your baby, is by looking at how many wet and dirty nappies they have. So if they're having lots of wet nappies, then it's just like us. If we drink loads, we nip to the toilet a lot, it shows that we're getting plenty through us. So we want lots of wet nappies with babies. It shows that they're well hydrated and they're getting plenty of fluid. And then in terms of the dirty nappies, we would like quite a few dirty nappies, but if they're artificially fed, they can sometimes go a couple of days without having a dirty nappy. Breastfed babies generally will have dirty nappies quite frequently because breast milk has a laxative effect, so they're less likely to be constipated, and they will generally have quite a few dirty nappies. We also look at the colour of the dirty nappy. So when babies are first born, their poo is very black, dark and thick and black. It's called meconium, and that's what's been sitting in their bowels as it's been developing, and then the body has to try and get rid of that. So you have quite a few of those poos, and you'll start going to a dark green and then a light green, and then going on to sort of a browny orangey colour, and even look at a certain point it will look like it has little seeds in it. And that's all very normal, and that's a normal process of the baby's bowels changing colour. So if that's happening by day 5, 6, 7, then we know that the baby is getting plenty. But if it's not happening and the poos stay green and dark for a bit longer, then we have to start thinking, is baby having enough milk? Whichever way we're feeding baby, is baby having enough milk? Shall we actually look at that and write down, okay, how often is baby feeding, how frequently, how long for, and start thinking about the actual milk supply that's there. Another sign of is my baby getting enough milk is we weigh the baby. So when babies are first born, they get weighed within the first couple of hours, and then we weigh them again when they are about 5 days old. And all babies lose weight well, most babies lose weight. It's perfectly normal for them to lose weight, and they're allowed to lose up to about 8% of their weight, like their general weight, for us to think that that's a normal amount. And that's because that meconium is quite heavy. Sometimes they have lots of fluid in their body that they need to get rid of from the birth, which has been pushed from the mom to the baby. So losing weight is an okay sign, as long as they don't lose too much. So when it goes between 8 to 10%, and we start thinking, is this maybe because of feeding? So we ask about feeding, we look about feeding, and then we come back out the next day to reweigh baby. But if their weight loss continues, and then we have to start thinking about any other issues which could potentially be causing weight loss, and we would refer if appropriate at the time. So they're good signs, you know, is my baby getting enough? So with the wet and dirty nappies, and the weight loss, and also thinking, is baby settled between feeds? A happy, well-fed baby should at least have periods of settledness. I'm not necessarily saying they would like to be put down. Babies like to be held, they like to be cuddled, so not necessarily put down, but they should be calm between feeds. They shouldn't constantly be frantic, they shouldn't constantly be hungry. If they are, then there's potentially a supply issue, and we have to look at that and think about, okay, how is the mom feeling? Does she feel like her milk is filling up and things? So that's that. The next thing to talk about when feeding your baby is winding. So I get a lot of questions of should I or should I not wind my baby, and when is appropriate to wind a baby, and how do you wind a baby? So obviously wind is what sort of builds up in their stomach as they're feeding. Breastfed babies naturally have less wind, because once they have a good seal on the breast, there's not much air. It's not like there's air in the breast for them to swallow. Whereas bottle-fed babies quite often can swallow air from the bottle if the milk sort of starts to come out of the teat a bit, or their latch on the bottle isn't very well, isn't very sort of sealed. So bottle-fed babies can need winding a little bit more frequently. What I sort of say is, if you're breastfeeding and a baby has come off the breast and is completely calm and settled, then I would just pop the baby down. They don't need to be winded, or sit and hold your baby. They don't need to be winded. But if your baby's had a really good feed and then is just a little bit wiggly and seems a bit uncomfortable, then try winding your baby. It could be that they have had a bit of an incorrect latch, or maybe they were a bit frantic at the beginning of the feed and swallowed a little bit of air before they actually went onto the breast. So it might not be a bad idea to wind your baby, but you don't necessarily have to. But if you are artificially feeding your baby, then you do need to wind your baby, and you probably need to wind at several points throughout the feed as well. So artificially fed babies, we like to do responsive feeding. So you're still looking at your baby, you've still got your baby holding your baby close and looking into your baby's eyes and talking to your baby, but you also need to pace that feed and slow that feed down. You don't want your baby to suck the whole bottle really quickly, so you've got to pace that feed and slow that feed down. So you do need to wind in between, because babies will swallow milk. So quite a natural sort of way for mums and dads to sort of feed their baby is to bring their baby up over, to win their babies, to bring their baby up over their shoulder. Always make sure you have a muslin or a blanket over your shoulder, because as many a times the babies have been sick down my shoulder and over people's backs. And you just you're supporting your baby's weight with your hand, and you're just like patting the back of the baby. So by not too hard, but not too soft either, because I've known mums be like this, and that's not going to bring up much wind. But you don't want to be too firm. As midwives, we're always slightly firmer than new parents anyway. So gently winding your baby that way will hopefully help them bring up some wind. Or you can sit your baby on your lap, supporting the weight of the body with your forearm, and resting the baby's head sort of in that crease again. And then by doing that, you can lean your baby forward, rub the back. This baby's a bit stiff, so it doesn't move quite so well, but you can lean your baby forward, rub their back, and also tap their back. And by doing that, I quite often bring up some wind as well. So so that's the main principles of winding your baby, and when you should or should not do it. It's important to note, if you are artificially feeding or if you are expressing breast milk, to sterilise correctly all of your equipment and make up feeds appropriately. We are a baby friendly initiative hospital. We advocate breastfeeding, but if anyone would like any information specifically on artificially feeding and how to make up feeds, please ask your midwife or ask the ward before you leave to make sure that you are aware of the safe principles of how to make up a feed correctly and ensure safe sterilisation of all of your equipment.